Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the On Air Advocate, where we provide education, support, and advocacy for special needs families, caregivers, and those with different abilities, mental health challenges, and chronic illness. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Tammy Flynn, and I am the host and producer of the On Air Advocate. And I am super excited if you are here this morning joining us, or whether you are catching this on the replay. Now, as always, if you think any of the content that we are talking about today could be relevant for anyone in your network or your circle, please hit the share button and share the love with others. Well, if you have been following along this last month, you know that we are covering a series on bile duct cancer. And I am very excited this morning to welcome to the show Dr. Langmuir. He is the Group Vice President of Oncology Targeted Therapies at Incyte. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, and during this series, we've kind of dived into all different parts of this. And I know you are going to bring a very different aspect to it. And we're going to be talking about clinical trials and FDA approvals and medications and all of those types of things. But before we dive into that, I would love for you to share with the audience just a little bit about your background and yourself.
Well, thank you. So originally I'm a pediatric oncologist, but I've been working in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry for about 20 years now. Focusing my work on clinical trials for cancer patients. And so for the last 6 years, I've been at Incyte, where I head up the clinical development of our oncology targeted therapies. And so these are drugs that are specifically targeted at particular molecular abnormalities in different tumors. So trying to find a very focused and selective approach to treating the cancer in different patients. And so I worked with a team here that was involved in the clinical trials for PublicAdministered, which is a selective FGFR inhibitor, clinical trials in bile duct cancer or cholangiocarcinoma.
And then how did that relationship start, the kind of that collaboration between Incyte and the CCF, between the two of you guys?
But I think the first thing is that in general in oncology, it's obviously very important to understand what the patient needs. And this is true across all diseases. But particularly for a rare disease like cholangiocarcinoma, I think it's particularly important to have that collaboration with all of the different entities that are working to help develop new drugs and help patients. So these include diagnostic companies, the health authorities, the physicians that are taking care of them, and then critically the patients and the patient advocates. Again, because in a rare disease, there's a lot we need to understand about what the patients are experiencing, what they're looking for, and patient advocate groups like the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation provide a sort of central, neutral, supportive place where patients can find the information they need about their disease. Again, it's a rare disease for us in the pharmaceutical industry. It's also a rare disease for patients and for physicians. So patients may never have heard of cholangiocarcinoma or bile duct cancer.
Right.
And so they need access to medical centers that can take care of that. They need access to information about their disease. And so Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation and other patient advocate groups provide a place where they can try to find that information.
Right. And with that, because obviously those that are being affected by it are, going to that group, how does that play into you finding those that can do clinical trials that would partake in something like that?
Yeah, so it really becomes a very close collaboration because we're trying to design clinical trials that ultimately, hopefully, will lead to approval of the drug. And for the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation, they're trying to provide access to patients for clinical trials. I think we all have a goal to try to improve access to clinical trials because that's how we learn and improve on our therapies for patients. But again, with a rare disease like this, there are many medical centers you could walk into where they're not going to have a clinical trial available for cholangiocarcinoma. So what the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation can do is provide a resource for patients to say, you have this disease, here's how we can help you understand it, but also here are the places you can go to get the medical care, to find clinical trials,
Right.
And get access to that.
And how long, and I know that for the year 2020 and 2021, I think we have heard more about clinical trials and FDA approval in the news and media more than we've ever heard that, in our lives. And so what does that process even look like when a company like yours is taking on this as a rare, more in that rare disease family?
Yeah.
There's not a zillion different companies, doing this. And like you were talking about before the show, you don't have as many people that are partaking in the clinical trials. How does that process even go in length of time in getting that approval?
Right. So just specifically for this drug pemigatinib, we started clinical development around 2015, 2016, with initial phase 1 trial. So this is your typical initial first trial in humans where you're initially trying to understand just the general safety of the drug. But also, again, we knew this was a targeted drug. We were specifically looking for tumors that had alterations, abnormalities in this FGFR gene. And so cholangiocarcinoma was one of the ones on the list. And so we tried to focus our phase 1 trial on those tumor types that have this FGFR abnormality. And so we enrolled a few patients that had cholangiocarcinoma, and we saw some evidence of activity. The patients seemed to have tumor responses or their disease stabilized. And so that then became a focus for our next stage of development. So around about probably 2017, we initiated a clinical trial specifically in cholangiocarcinoma, looking at patients whose tumors have these FGFR abnormalities. So that trial ran for a couple of years. The data looked very encouraging. We submitted those data to FDA, to EMA in Europe and other global health authorities, and had the first approval for pemigatinib from FDA in 2020. So that sort of gives you a rough idea of what the timeline was for our drug. Obviously, it can be very different. Sometimes you get a signal that drives things a bit quicker, but often it can take much longer to get there. So, and so it was around about the time that we were starting the first specific study for cholangiocarcinoma that we started to reach out to the physicians who are experts here. We started to have the discussions with FDA around what we would need to see to be able to get the approval, and with the patient advocate groups as well, to try and understand what the patient's needs were in this disease.
Now, once it gets that FDA approval, does that mean right away that it can be open to the general, public and administered that way? Or are they still in some type of a trial process?
No, generally in the US, shortly after the approval, the drug becomes available to patients with cholangiocarcinoma.
Okay.
Specifically our indication is for those who previously received frontline therapy. So the standard of care is chemotherapy initially, but then after that, that's when pemigatinib has its approved indication. So.
Okay. And as we are in 2021 and we're looking to 2022 and obviously the future, where is this drug at this point in time? And is there anything forecasted for other FDA approvals of other treatments, clinical trials that are happening? Are you a part of any of those? Is there other ones that are going on currently?
Oh, absolutely. So we're looking at other trials with this agent. So specifically for cholangiocarcinoma, we have an ongoing study in the frontline setting, so the initial treatment of patients with metastatic cholangiocarcinoma. So again, as I said, the standard of care is chemotherapy. Most patients, when they're diagnosed, if they have metastatic disease, which unfortunately most of the patients do, the standard of care is chemotherapy. After chemotherapy, there's not much available, and that's where pemigatinib is currently approved in that setting. But right now, we're doing a study comparing pemigatinib with that initial chemotherapy in the FGFR selected patients to see if actually it's better to have the initial treatment with pemigatinib rather than starting with chemotherapy. And no one is particularly fond of chemotherapy in this disease. It's not very well tolerated, and it's not particularly effective. So I think patients are looking for something that hopefully will be better tolerated and more efficacious. So that's the goal of this study that's ongoing right now. And at the same time, for our drug, we're looking at other tumors right now as well, other tumors that have this FGFR abnormality. So cholangiocarcinoma was the first one, but we're looking at some other tumors as well. And over the next few years, we'll have some data in those.
Okay. And as you were stating, so the research has been positive in this. And then how long do you usually, when somebody is in like the clinical trial, and then when a new drug is released, how long do you follow those patients to collect the data for that?
In the clinical trials, I mean, generally we follow them indefinitely, trying to get as much long-term survival data as we can. So the primary endpoint in the study that led to approval was tumor response rate. So what proportion of patients that got the drug had a tumor shrinkage, specifically of at least 30%. but that was the primary endpoint. And then a key secondary endpoint was the duration of response. So it's obviously great if your tumor shrinks, but you want that to be durable. You want that response to last. And so we saw about 36% of patients in the trial had a tumor shrinkage. The duration of response was about 9 months. So those were the data that we submitted to FDA and led to the approval. But we're very interested in the longer term endpoints as well. So we follow all these patients out ultimately to try to get a sense of what the overall survival in these patients looks like.
Okay. And if you are someone who is, newly diagnosed, obviously the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation is a great place to get resources and help and supports and all of that. As you know, a lot of people, when they get the news of a different diagnosis, they may be diving into doing their own research and trying to figure things out for themselves. Is there a place, online, valid resources, you know what I'm saying, to go to kind of learn more about clinical trials, FDA approvals, how the drug is doing in others, or would all of that still be found on like the CCF site?
So there are good resources. I think the NCI, for example, has a lot of general information for patients about clinical trials in general, about specific diseases. Again, I think, particularly if you're a patient that's near a, major medical center, Boston, New York, a place like that, then there are physicians there that you can go to. They're experts in the topic that can give you information as well. A lot of those medical centers will have information online as well. So you can search, the websites of some of these, major medical centers and find information there. Honestly, I think the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation sort of makes that also one-stop shopping, because we all do this. We go on Google and we Google it. But I think if you get the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation or any of these other patient advocate groups, they've done that work for you, right? They've compiled all the information you need about the disease. They've compiled all the and very patient focused as well. Some of these other websites, they may be much more focused on molecular issues and so on, but the patient advocate groups focus on what you need as a patient to help you understand the disease and what you can do about it. So something like Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation has all the information you need about your disease, help you understand it, what are the treatments available, what are the resources for clinical trials, where you can go to get access to a clinical trial and so on. So if I knew someone that had it, that would be my first recommendation, is start there, and then you can dive deeper into specifics of clinical trials of different treatments.
Yes, and how exciting a time this is. I know in talking with Stacy, who is the founder, 15 years, that the organization has been together, and so many exciting things, though, are on the front for those that are diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma. So that is wonderful. Dr. Langmuir, I am so happy and thankful that you joined us this morning to share, this information. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to leave with the audience?
I think we're very grateful to the collaboration and discussions we've had with the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. I think that the advice they've given us on what patients want to see, specifically in clinical trials, is very valuable. How they view different endpoints, what are the endpoints that are important to them. That's incredibly valuable. But beyond that, it's almost the global approach they have to the clinical trial process in general. How do we make clinical trials in general more streamlined? How do we get patients access to the molecular testing they need? Because a lot of these new drugs are very targeted at particular molecular abnormalities. So how do we get patients access to that testing? Again, something like lung cancer, it's pretty routine that patients get tested, but in something like cholangiocarcinoma, it's not. And so we need patients to get access to that. How do we interact with different health authorities to get the right endpoint? So I think in many ways, we get very specific advice from Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation on our specific clinical trials, how we can make that better. But then also their role is much broader than that, and basically overall improving access to trials for patients and ultimately improving therapeutics for patients is sort of a much more broad goal that's incredibly valuable.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Dr. Langmuir, for sharing this morning. So happy to hear all the wonderful works that you guys are doing at Incyte as well as the CCF. And I just thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much.
If you guys want to know any more about the On Air Advocate, you can head on over to onairadvocate.com and you can find all of our resources there. Also, after this episode, we will drop all of the links and everything that me and Dr. Van Meer were talking about below so that you have easy access. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.